Hi, my name is Dr. Katherine Skinner, and I am here today to talk to you about vital open infrastructures in a volatile moment. This is a summer 2025 CNI briefing. So as I start this presentation, I want to introduce myself. I'm the Director of Programs at a nonprofit called Invest in Open Infrastructure. And Invest in Open Infrastructure is all about strengthening both the adoption of and investments in open infrastructure. So my role there is to develop and coordinate programs that do exactly that: strengthen adoption, strengthen investment. And I want to pause for a moment to just own the term open infrastructure because I'll be using it throughout the rest of this presentation. So when I'm saying open infrastructure, I'm referring to the set of active operational services, protocols, standards, and software that the academic ecosystem needs in order to perform its functions throughout the research lifecycle. And more specifically, I'm referring to those that embrace an open ethos. So those that aim towards open source and open access, not just in features, but also in engagement and governance. And there are lots of these. Over the last 30 plus years, the academic, scholarly, knowledge oriented community has built a lot of open infrastructures to serve the needs of creating, disseminating, uh, discovering, and preserving content, information that we want to share with each other. And so here on this slide, you're seeing a lot of different registries and views and maps of some of those infrastructures. I want to point to the there's a lot, in part because over the last 30 plus years, there has been a lot of development and a lot of different types of tools have arisen in that time frame, and a lot of them have stuck around. So the dedication of a small community that intensely cares about the use of an open infrastructure has been enough to keep that open infrastructure alive. And that's been because there were grant funds that helped to support, especially any kind of innovative or new development directions. There were and have been academic institutions as well as other types of research institutions that have hosted these open infrastructures and basically provided a home for their staff and their technical needs and other things. And then there have been institutions that have not only used and adopted, but have also contributed either through volunteer time and development hours, or often financially through membership fees and through other forms. That's really important context for what I'm going to talk about today, and for this study that IOI recently ran. It's a pilot. Hopefully, we'll be building on it. But we're in this strange space in 2025 where the kind of environment that we've had for open infrastructure, like many other things in research and scholarship, it's undergoing massive and maybe unprecedented change. Science is a highly international endeavor, but the support for science is closely tied to these national policies and grant funding and other things that I was just mentioning, especially the federal funding sources in different spaces. And there's significant cuts that have been made to open science research funding in the US in 2025, but also in Argentina, in France, in the Netherlands. It's not just a US phenomenon. This is something that is happening along global lines. And cuts are a significant destabilizing factor, certainly for those who have been using and have been used to being able to have access to grant funds, but also institutions that have served as both the hosts and the adopters and the contributors, which are increasingly being hit by this kind of avalanche of cuts to funding that has been there for higher education institutions, for example, particularly in the US. And so we really see this as an urgent moment in planning towards some potential scenarios in which the funding and institutional support for open initiatives, including volunteer time and bandwidth, are very likely to quickly decline and decline and decline. We're looking at what could be a real funding cliff for many open infrastructures, as well as for many of those institutions that depend on those open infrastructures. And so at IOI, part of what we've been trying to understand, particularly since January, for those of us who are in the United States, we have people in multiple parts of the world, um, trying to understand which open infrastructures are most likely to be at risk and how will anyone know or choose which ones they want to focus on stabilizing. Getting information about what's at risk is so subjective and so difficult, and it depends on so many external factors, but also developing external factors. And also depends on how secure or well embedded or resilient each of these open infrastructures actually is. And so, starting in February, we invited open infrastructures to share their stories with us. We put out a blog post and we spoke with many infrastructures following that blog post and found, unsurprisingly, that they were unnerved. They were painfully aware that their own business models were likely to be challenged or compromised by the massive changes underway, particularly those that were hitting any infrastructures that depended on US federal funding or higher education funding. And they were also really aware that there's no way to predict or forecast or respond to the changes that were starting to happen because they were unfolding at such dizzying speed. And so I would warrant I think we can say that most open infrastructures are still very much assessing their own levels of risk, but very few are feeling like this is a time of plenty or a time to relax and assume that the status quo is going to carry forward. So, from Invest in Open Infrastructure's perspective, we wanted to understand how can we provide guidance to those who are trying to establish where to concentrate their energy and their resources in this particular moment in time. So, to answer that question, or at least to get at a little bit of that question, we did a pulse poll. This was intended to be a very closely bounded, very tightly scoped study that would get us some in the moment information in March of 2025 from a very specific snapshot of the field, those who are already connected with Invest in Open Infrastructure through our newsletter list. Um, and we wanted to understand their connections to a bounded set of open infrastructures, those that you see on the slide, which are infrastructures that as of March 2025 were included in InfraFinder, which is a tool that Invest in Open Infrastructure provides. So our newsletter subscribers include a whole lot of different types of open infrastructure stakeholders, including those who build and manage infrastructure, as well as those who use it or who fund it or who do both. And so, to mitigate some of the potential concerns that we knew folks would have in what was an incredibly trying climate in March of 2025, we designed the poll so that it was super brief, didn't require a lot of time or effort. There were 5 questions, only 2 of those were actually required. As I said, it had clear boundaries and clear purpose. It centered explicitly on those 104 infrastructures featured in InfraFinder and then the 1,000 roughly newsletter recipients or newsletter subscribers of Invest in Open. We also made sure that everywhere that this was announced or mentioned, so whether it was in the poll itself, the survey tool, or whether it was in the email invitation or a blurb that we put in the newsletter, we always consistently stated the same thing, that this poll is meant to help IOI identify groupings, trends, and scenarios. And we promised respondents that the results were not going to be used to rank or exclude or create competition among the breadth of open infrastructures that support our community. In no way have we been interested in this pilot, small pilot, in figuring out like what's the most popular open infrastructure right now. Not interesting to us. What is interesting to us is how how broad or how narrow is the set of infrastructures that people who are asked directly consider most vital for their work, not most useful, not most important, most vital for their own work. And knowing that the group that we were distributing this poll to included a multi-stakeholder environment. So it included funders, it included open infrastructures themselves, it included those who adopt it, those who use it, and those who fund it. So librarians and publishers and all kinds of different researchers, all kinds of different people within the scholarly community and knowledge community. Um, we really wanted to make sure that they were not provoked by this into thinking about ranking or popularity contests. So, with that said, you're looking at the first question that was presented in our poll, which is, as I said, which of the following infrastructures are most vital for your work? And we let people choose up to 5 from the InfraFinder list. And so, some of the things that we saw in the respondents, and there were 170 respondents, we saw that we had more libraries than any other single group out of the groups that we established. So we asked, one of the questions was, which best describes your focus or work area most of the time? And we saw libraries, we saw publishers, scholarly, academic, and research. Those two categories were easily half of the participants. We also saw a pretty high degree of researchers in any discipline, so 22 respondents or 13%. We saw a decent amount of data science and metadata experts, so 15 respondents, 9%. And then, and so on, technology, scholarly communication, non-publishing scholarly communication, and other were the other categories. And we also looked at other to see, that was a write-in, to see what kinds of commonalities were coming up in that space. We also asked, in what country or region or geolocation do you primarily work? And we saw here that we had a pretty close number of folks from the United States and Europe, not surprising to us, knowing who's on our lists. But also a decent representation from North America, non-US, Africa, and Latin America. And again, we had other category where people could write in their own geolocation based on what they thought of as important for their context. So, what we were looking for as we put this poll together is really summarized in this little yellow box. We were looking at concentration first and foremost. How compact or how outspread are the results? Is it that we have a few infrastructures that are named over and over and over and over again, and then a lot of infrastructures that are named once or twice? Or how does that breakdown work? Is it a long tail? Is it a short tail? How does it look? We also were interested in co-naming. So, how often are infrastructures listed together by a single respondent? So, are there lots of respondents that if they chose Creative Commons, they also chose one of the publishing softwares or something along those lines? Like, could we see relationships between the co-naming of Vive infrastructures by single respondents? And then finally, constellations. We were really interested and still are really interested in how deep the relationships might be between particular sets of infrastructures and how those manifest in what people have or what respondents have said. And of course, when I say we had 170 respondents, what I really mean is we had 170 responses. We did not require any personally identifying information or any kind of signal that this was a one submission kind of thing. Again, what we were aiming for here was not super rigid reading. It was a general sense of like, can we find some interesting things by asking these relatively simple questions of a bounded group about a bounded set of infrastructures in this moment in time? So, what did we find? First, let's look at the concentration. So, our 170 responses named 80 infrastructures, and they named those between 1 and 59 times. And on average, each of those infrastructures was selected by 10 respondents. and the median number of times that each infrastructure was selected was 4. As you can see in the chart here, the data wasn't highly concentrated around a small number of infrastructures. Instead, it was pretty broad and it included a long tail as well. So more than half of the 80 selected infrastructures were named between 1 and 4 times. Okay, so it's 44 of them, or 55%, that were named between 1 and 4 times. 16 were named between 5 and 9 times, 8 were named between 10 to 20 times, and 6 were named to each of the 2 highest categories, which were 21 to 34 times and 35 to 59 times. So the relatively narrow set of 12 infrastructures in that final set that was named more than 20 times really stand out, or in the blue and the yellow if you're seeing color, but in those last 2 categories, those stand out as especially vital to many respondents. And those might be worth further investigation in a future study to determine if that finding holds with a broader pool of respondents. None of these results were super big surprises, but that consistency with which many people across the stakeholder groups selected the same 12 infrastructures was relatively striking for us. Other things that we found. So we looked, as I mentioned, at region and geolocation, and wanted to understand if there were notable differences between which infrastructures were selected by respondents from different regions and geolocations. Now, that comparison was complicated by large differences in the number of respondents, and as a result of that, the number of infrastructures that were selected. So where we had the best comparative power was with the named infrastructures from the US, where we had 61 respondents and 60 infrastructures, and Europe, where we had 59 respondents, so close to the same, and 48 infrastructures, again, relatively close to the same. So we could do some limited comparisons across those 2 geolocations. And then the number of respondents and named infrastructures in Africa was much lower, with 17 respondents and 33 infrastructures. But we could also draw some careful comparisons across the Europe, US, and Africa spaces where those seemed meaningful. So that's where we kind of concentrated our investigation. And the biggest surprise, which may be worth some further investigation, was the difference that we found in repository services, repository software, and publishing system counts across the 3 locations. So open repository software and tools that were listed in InfraFinder, so things that an institution could assemble in order to provide its own services. You can think of it that way. Those were cited over 3 times more by US-based respondents than by European respondents. European respondents were much more likely to list repository services where they are using something that is being hosted elsewhere. And then 6 times more than by African respondents. And that's a lot, even given the notably different respondent sizes in Europe and Africa. We also saw that publishing systems in InfraFinder, so again, hosted publishing systems as opposed to publishing services, where it's the 2 different, or publishing services versus publishing systems. Sorry, I said that backwards. We saw those also had some interesting dynamics, where the publishing systems in InfraFinder were much more often cited by respondents in Europe. So again, these are like tools and stuff that you can assemble. That was 33 times. Than by the US respondents, who only cited it 18 times, or African respondents 10 times. So that size gap too is really interesting. And explanations for those differences might be related to InfraFinder's current coverage of repository and publishing platforms and tools, but it also may actually signal some differences in reliance on services versus system elements in different geolocations. And then we also looked at differences based on self-identified roles. So the poll provided 9 options plus the write-in option of other. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we had respondent roles. We had the highest scoring categories of libraries and publishing, scholarly and academic and research, and then also research itself in any discipline. And we concentrated our analysis primarily on those hottest categories accordingly. And we found that distinctions in infrastructure selection seem to be both clear and meaningful across these role types. So the data show how important it is, above all else, to include the perspectives of multiple stakeholder types and roles in any analysis of open infrastructure tools, and also in any planning activities that are undertaken at a meta level to understand or respond to open infrastructure needs. So people in these different roles really do rely on different infrastructure components, and it means that we need to stay conscious as a field of making sure that we're including those multiple stakeholder perspectives when we're trying to gauge, use or interest or vitality of different infrastructures. So that brings us to maybe the graphic that's the most fun to look at, but also the end of my presentation. So as we were designing the poll, we hope to be able to identify what sets and groupings of infrastructures most often appear together. And we termed these constellations. And we suspect that this type of analysis might provide some of the most nuanced and interesting stories about relationships between open infrastructures, particularly if it's layered with other data. And so we may be able to identify different ways that these relationships and constellations are forming between different types of open infrastructures serving different types of roles. What I can say here right now is that there are a couple of interesting elements that we expand on in the State of Open Infrastructure report. You're welcome to go there and look at it. But the most important one is that we did definitely see that the interconnectivity between infrastructures is super dense. And you can see that in this graphic. We did not use weighted lines, so you're not seeing anything that indicates the number of times something was selected. That's intentional. Again, we don't want popularity contests and rankings from this. But what you can see is the density of connections between what kinds of infrastructures are named. And just based on these relationships that are implicit in 170 respondents' answers or responses that included up to 5 infrastructures each, we can already see some meaningful patterns. We'll be reporting more on all of this in the future. So please stay tuned. And if this kind of work is of interest to you, or if you have a small community, whether it be a consortium or user community or whatever that might be interested in using this poll or working with us on running the poll again in your context, we'd be really interested in hearing from you. So thank you so much. Please be in touch, and thank you to CNI for hosting this.